Welcome. In earlier demonstrations, we saw how to draw a group of trees in a distance, something like this, so where we drew the trees and then we drew the other trees behind and, created a nice landscape, where we have a feel of a wooded area. And then we also saw actually how to draw something like this, right? So where we just, use this hatching, this perpendicular, this parallel lines to create a feel for a tree foliage and essentially draw a kind of wooded area. So what we will do in this demonstration is to essentially draw something like this using a different technique, using these scribble lines. So essentially, we have seen how to use the scribble lines to draw the tree foliage in other demonstrations. But what I want to do here is to essentially, bring out a feel of a drawing something like this using the scribble stroke. And my whole aim with this demonstration is to show you how you can actually draw simple drawings, and a scribble stroke is a great way to draw a simple tree foliage and create a nice kind of drawing. So what I want to do in this demonstration is to essentially use this stroke to essentially create a kind of wooded area feel. So this will be a different way in which we do this, that kind of composition. But what I will show is that how you can actually use the scribble stroke also to bring out a nice feel for a wooded area. And this is a really cool technique because all you're doing is essentially just using the scribble strokes. So you're just sitting and scribbling, and in the end you start to kind of give it a form of a kind of a wooded area. So this is really cool, simple composition, and it's really fun to do. Something that you can sit with a glass of coffee or whatever your favorite drink is, and then start to just scribble, just like the way I'm doing it, and in the end kind of end up with a nice composition. And the other thing that we will do at the end is also to draw the reflection of this wooded area in water. So we haven't done this before, but we have seen how to draw the reflection in water of a mountain and other elements. And what we will do also at the end is to see how you can actually draw the reflection in water of a kind of this kind of wooded area using a different technique. So essentially I will show you yet another technique to draw the reflection in water, and this time we will be drawing this kind of wooded area using the scribble stroke and then drawing this reflection in the water. So essentially what we do over here is to kind of just use the scribble stroke to again lay out the foliage of trees that are kind of in the distance. So essentially what we saw before is that there are two approaches. Like, so in one approach you can define these trees individually. So essentially we draw the kind of tree individually, and then we draw the trees in the back, and then hide part of the foliage and make them smaller to show the distance. So this is one approach. And then what we also saw was how you can actually create a kind of distant wooded area using this technique where the foliage is kind of intermingled. So essentially you don't have a clear indication of individual trees, but together as a whole we get a nice feel for the wooded area. So our eyes can make out the fact that there are different trees, and then we added these trunks to essentially reinforce that. So what we are doing is drawing this technique, essentially just creating a foliage of trees that are together. But what we are now doing is essentially, instead of using these kind of parallel lines, we are using this scribble stroke to draw that kind of foliage of trees that are together. So this is another cool way of doing it. And what you do is essentially simply use the scribble stroke and essentially create an initial layer of foliage. So what I have done is essentially to just lay down this kind of outline. The other thing to keep in mind is that just try to make your outline something like this, where you have individual kind of up. So this indicates one kind of tree, second tree, something like that. So so do not make it very flat, do not make it very kind of uniform, but have a form something like this. So that's what I did for the top, right? So you create like a form like that, and then what you do essentially is to just use the scribble stroke, like something like this that we have seen before. You just use the scribble stroke just to kind of lay out that initial layer of foliage over here. And again, do not make it very uniform. So this is not what we are looking at, but what we are looking at, you moving our pen in random, something like this, so you just keep up moving it, and then what happens is that, this gives a nice random feel. And essentially, it starts to, give a feel for kind of a foliage, kind of leaves, so this is how our brain interprets it. So essentially, keep it random, keep it moving. And then what you will have is, this kind of foliage, start to come together. And again, this is a very cool technique, simple technique that you can do, with any drink at any time, right? So essentially just, keep your pen moving and just, essentially you start to have a, feel for a foliage like this. So that's what I did over here, so something very similar to what we did, with the parallel lines, where we are just drawing, a feel for different trees, whose foliage are kind of, merging into each other and are not, very distinguishable. But here we are using these kind of scribble lines for that purpose. So there we have it, right? So essentially this is, how you can lay down a easy, layer of foliage, and if you want you can even add more, right? So this is something that you can easily adjust for your for your size. So depending on how big you want to make it, you can add more or less. And again, if this is like it's a simple drawing, essentially this is not too big, so like I've said before, use the scribble stroke for trees that are not too close. So if you have trees that are up close, then you need to use a different technique that I've shown in other demonstrations. But essentially, scribble stroke is a great way to draw trees that are kind of a bit at a distance, right? So you give an indication of the foliage, but essentially it's not up close. So there we have it, right? So we just draw an initial layer of foliage, and then what we will do is something similar to the what we did in the other drawing, which is to just draw the trunks. So essentially you start to again draw these trunks over here, and the way we draw the trunk is again to have a kind of jagged darkness at one end, something like this. So again you lay down this tapered line and over here, and then you choose one edge and add a kind of jagged darkness. And by jagged I mean that there's a bit of roughness at the edges, inside edges, like over here, and that gives a feel for a bark texture as well. So again, if this just jaggedness makes us feel that this is a tree trunk, and but if make it very uniform, something like this gives a feel for a cylinder, but not that of a kind of bark. So what we want is a bit of jagged darkness, and that's what we will do. So essentially we just lay down the trunks and add a bit of jagged darkness, something like this. The other thing to notice is that I'm not really kind of trying to match these trunks with any kind of foliage. So essentially you just draw the a foliage, and then you can just add the trunks wherever you want. Essentially kind of try to make a nice distribution. So I have one over here, and in between, then what I can do is to make one trunk at a bit of a distance. So if you move it further out, then that trunk is seen and that tree is seen as in a distance. So that's what I'm doing. So I'm just adding the trunk that are a bit closer, and then what I will do is in between I will add more trunk that are a bit further out, something like this, right? So this is again kind of something that you just play with, and something we did with other composition. And if you want, you can even add more trunks further out. So the trunks that are most furthest out, you can simply make them a solid dark, a tapered solid dark, something like this. So this is appropriate for the trunk that are furthest out. So that's how you do it, right? So essentially lay out this first layer of foliage, and then you just simply add the trunk. And what happens as we have seen with that other demonstration is that our mind starts to kind of interpret this foliage with individual trees. So essentially our mind looks at the trunks, and it kind of somehow makes a sense, and starts to see this as a kind of assembly of a lot of trees. So that's what we want, right? So essentially we were not drawing the individual tree shapes, but essentially we're drawing this kind of mixed foliage, and then we're just simply adding trunks. And this is similar to what we did with the other demonstration, where we used the parallel technique, something like this. But what we're doing now is to essentially use a different technique, but creating a similar feel for our composition. So like I said, I like to show different ways in which you can do things, and this is another great way in which you can easily draw any kind of a nice simple landscape whenever you have any time, right? So this is a very pleasing landscape where you see a sense of distance, and you have a sense of wooded area as well. And yeah, so it's very very simple way to do it is to essentially draw these kind of foliage using the scribble stroke, and just add these trunks at the base, something like this. So to keep in mind to distribute your trunks. So essentially some trunks are in the front, and then what I will do is I will then add some trunks at the back as well, something like this, right? And if you want, you can just make a solid taper for the trunks that are very further out. So again, depending on if you want to make it very wooded, then you can simply add a bit more trunks versus less. You can simply do it like that. And then finally I will add one more trunk over here. So there you have it, so you can now see that, how very quickly we just put together this foliage, and just by adding tree trunks, we already have a nice sense of, a wooded area over here. And now what you can do if you want, is to add a bit more, tonal variation in this foliage. So essentially, I didn't really add much, light and dark initially. So I like to, have a one uniform layer. And once you have defined your trunks, what you can now do is to then add, some more darkness at this point of intersection of the trunk and the foliage. So essentially I like to do that. So that gives a bit of weight and, kind of nice feel to the foliage. So what I will do is essentially just make this bottom a bit darker, essentially where the trunk and the foliage kind of meet. So this area I make it a bit darker. Over here I can make it a bit darker. So again, we have seen before that to bring out the volume, you need to have a bit of tonal variation. So what I will do essentially is to make this base where the trunk and the foliage meets a bit darker. And here you can see this is dark, this is light, and this is giving us a sense of volume. So that's what we are doing essentially, is to make the bottom a bit darker, and then the top is a bit lighter. So that will help us achieve the kind of volume that we want in our foliage. So that's what I'm doing. So once I have my trunks defined, I'll just go ahead and then add a bit of more scribble at the base over there to kind of darken it. So again, I go ahead over here and darken it a bit more. And again, the thing to notice is that I didn't really define any foliage, but somehow, just because you have the trunk, your mind will start to interpret this and see, those trees in there. So this is quite amazing. Is that, for example, I don't really have a clear distinction, but still, your mind can make out that this is kind of a foliage, of different trees together. But if you want, you can always, add a bit more of, explicit indications. If you want, you can just add a bit more darkness over here. So, this starts to indicate that this tree, is kind of, separate. So you can always add those indications as such. But the real fun is to simply simply, put down this foliage lines, and then once you have the foliage, defined, then just add some trunks, and then at the bottom, darken it where the trunk and the foliage meets, and this starts to kind of, give you a nice feel for a wooded area. So something like this. So there we have it, right? And then if you want, you can add a bit more, kind of, a little bit more darks here and there just to give it more volume. So there we have it. So this is how you can draw the same kind of wooded feel using scribble strokes, and do it very effectively, very quickly. So like in under 10 minutes you are able to easily put down this such kind of nice wooded area. And what we can do in the end is to essentially draw some kind of grass. But what I will do in addition over here is to essentially also kind of draw a reflection of this wooded area in the water. So that's something that new that we will learn in this demonstration. So let me actually first put down just the ground cover. And as we have seen in the demonstrations, we should always kind of try to ground our trunks. And the way we do it is to simply use this kind of very small strokes. So essentially this is a grass stroke that we use, but since our trunks are very small, what I will do is to simply use dots, some kind of. So what we need to do is to create some kind of darkness at the base of these trunks, so essentially kind of make them feel grounded. And I will use the same dots to also define the ground cover as well. So that's that's how we can do it. When the trunks are very far, we don't really have space to kind of make the grass bigger or anything like that. I simply use these dots to just kind of make some darkness at the base of the trunk. So again, if you have a trunk like this and you need to ground it, what you need to do is to simply add a bit of darkness in a shape something like this to ground the trunk. So essentially when you add a bit of dark around its edges and kind of in this shape, something, use a shape like this. So do not make it very straight, a shape like this, like we have seen here. What happens is that that indicates that there is some kind of ground cover and helps ground the trunk. So that really always makes the trunk much more effective. So we don't feel over here you can feel that the trunk is there's no clarity in terms of how the trunk is grounded. And just by adding a bit of dark, something like this over here, now you can quickly see that the trunk is looking grounded and it's much more appealing. So it's always try to ground your trunks something like this. Then essentially over here, since we have very less space, I'm just using this dot, a bit of just small tick marks to even indicate grass or ground cover or something like that. So and again, if you want, you can add even more trunks. So for example, I have some white over here, so if I want, I can even add one more trunk over here. So now this now you get even more sense of distance. So if you add more smaller trunks right here, you add more sense of distance. So for example, just by adding this trunk, now we have more sense of distance. So this is how if you want, you can have the trees a bit closer together, or if you want, you can even introduce more sense of distance by adding very small trunks that are just barely visible from under the foliage. So this is something up to you. So depending on your composition, you can decide how much distance you want to have in your drawing. And so what I will do is simply add a bit more of this grass at the base to ground these trunks. So this is how, again, you just use these dots, and just make the base of the trunk a bit darker. So we have seen this in detail in the demonstrations, right? So it's always good to ground the trunk. And if we have more space, then we can use bit bigger grass, and we can even use the wildflowers or different elements. But since over here the whole composition is at a distance, what I will do is I will simply use this kind of dots, right, just to ground the trunk over here, something like this over here, and something like this. And just you can even use the dots to kind of create a kind of ground cover, right? So something like this. So there we have it. So this is how you can easily ground the trunks, and you already have a nice feel for a kind of wooded area. And if you want, in other demonstrations we drew the parallel lines like this to even indicate some kind of distant tree line behind these trees. So just to show you that this is the other demonstration we did here. So over here we had some space between the foliage and the trees, and we added these parallel lines to indicate that there is something that extends behind the trees. In this composition we have actually we don't have that much space in our composition, so we don't really have to do it. So there's some white over here, so you can leave it as is, right? So it depends. If you want, you can add a distant that kind of parallel lines to indicate a distant tree line as well, or you can just leave it like this. Or over here, I even added one more trunk, right? So you can even add more trunks to kind of indicate even something like this. So here you can see just by adding this very small line, we are indicating that those trunks are even more visible in the distance. So it adds more depth to our drawing. So I just added a few more trunks to achieve that depth over here. And then again, I will just add a dot or something like this to indicate some kind of ground cover over there. And I'll go ahead and just kind of provide the I will ground these trunks as well over here just by using the dots, something like this over here. So again, what I'm doing over here, so just I use a bit of dot just to kind of create some kind of ground. So essentially, in another demonstration we saw that you can use these kind of ground lines, and then you can draw some kind of foliage on this to essentially define the ground. But over here, we really have the ground and the trunks are very small, so I'm just using a dot. And what happens also is that we want to take away this white spot. So in another demonstration we use these parallel lines to take away the white spots in between. And what we can do now is to just use dots as well to indicate some kind of foliage. So again, we saw this in other demonstrations, is that when you have a drawing like this, which is a wooded area, you want to take away the white, because the white confuses the brain, because you also expect something over there in terms of some other foliage or something else. So what you can do is to simply add a bit of dot, something like this, very light dots, just to kind of take away the white. And over here what happens is, as you can see, when I add the dot, it takes away the white and gives a more indication of some kind of foliage or some other tree behind it. So that's something you can do as well. So instead of using these parallel lines, if you don't have much space, you can simply use a dot to again take away that white and still indicate some kind of thing behind your front layer of trees. So that's what I just did. So there we have it, right? So now I've essentially grounded the trunks and then added a bit of foliage using these dots. And what we will do in the end is to show its reflection in the water. So this is a nice simple landscape that if you want, you can stop at this point and just enjoy your work. And the other thing you can do if you want is to essentially draw its reflection, and this can also be easily done. So what we will do is essentially start by drawing the kind of a river bank. Essentially what we are now doing is essentially trying to seeing how we can have the reflection of this this wooded area in the water. So I start by kind of laying down this kind of river bank, and as you can see again, I've tried to have an interesting shape, right? So I'm not using a very flat line, but having a bit of flow to my line. The first thing that we do is to essentially define the river bank, and by river bank I mean that you need to have some transition between the ground and the water, and this river bank can be easily defined by using this kind of lines, essentially something like this. So essentially you use these kind of parallel lines, and what you're doing is essentially defining how deep the river bank is, essentially how deep the transition is from the ground to the river. So this is something again, if you want, you can make it deep, or if you want, you can make it shallow, or you can even vary it. So what I did is to just essentially have it less and then kind of make it more over here. So essentially this also adds kind of interest to the drawings, if you can have these elements in different variations. So I don't want to make it very uniform. I don't want to have flat line and then have a flat width for my bank, but I can also vary it and add more interest to my drawing. So that's what I will do. I will simply add but more here and something like this. So this is how you can define your river bank, and then what you do essentially is to draw the reflection of these trees to essentially indicate water. So since we don't have color in these drawings, what we need to do is bring out the suggestion of certain things to indicate a certain element. And by water I mean that you have to show the reflection, and the reflection is what helps us interpret that thing as water. So that's what we will do, is to essentially kind of draw the reflection of these trees in the water. And in other demonstration we saw that you can use either these parallel lines to draw a still reflection, or you can use a horizontal lines to draw a kind of hazy reflection. So these were the two techniques we saw in other demonstrations to essentially draw the reflection in water. What we will do in this demonstration is to look at a different technique. The other technique that you can use is to essentially draw the flowing lines of water themselves to indicate reflection. So essentially what we do is we start by laying down these lines. So these are the kind of lines for the water that is flowing. So essentially a line something like this. So this is kind of water flowing. So I'm not using a straight line. You can use a straight line, but I like these lines are much more effective. Just kind of a bit angles, slanting like lines like this. So these are the lines that indicates the water essentially flowing. So something like this. So this is kind of small ripple kind of thing. So this is the line for our water flowing. So what I'm doing in this technique is to essentially draw the lines for the water, and what I will do is essentially to kind of increase their density to start to draw the reflection of the trees. So the first step is to draw these lines reflecting the water. So something like this. So as you can see already, our mind is starting to see this kind of wavy pattern and something like this as water. So this is, so this, our mind associates certain things, with certain elements, and with water, this kind of wavy feel is associated with water. So that's what I'm using. So I kind of, lay down my initial set of lines, and this gives us a feel of, water. But what we really want to do is to now bring out the shadow of, I'm sorry, not the shadow, the reflection. So we want to bring out the reflection of the trees, and with the reflection, we will have a, our brain will kind of, firmly, indicate and understand this as water. So I lay down my initial lines for the water using these other these kind of lines, and then what I do next is to start to add more of those lines over here where I want reflection. So essentially reflection will make the area of water a bit darker. So that's what we have to do. So essentially just add more lines, and again, do not add straight, do not make it like this, but essentially keep introducing this kind of flowing lines, something like this, more of this. So essentially you just add more of it, and then you can intersect. So we're not just So you can intersect and just draw more of it. So essentially just keep adding more, and what you will start to notice is that it starts to get darker over here. So it's starting to get darker over here, and that is giving our brain a feeling of reflection. So here you can see it's a bit darker. And the other good thing is that when you use these lines and add these lines in this manner, the reflection is very hazy. So this is something similar to the horizontal line technique we saw, but even this is even more hazier, because these lines, they indicate movement, and then there is no clear kind of reflection of the trees. And that's what we want essentially. Whenever you have trees and a bit of moving water, the reflection will be very hazy, something like this. And that's what we get over here. Just by adding these more lines, we get a very hazy feel for the reflection in the water. So that's what I'm doing, simply adding more of these lines, right? Bit more, and do not make it uniform. So do not just keep doing it over here, but move your hand over here, a bit over there. So just keep moving your hand. So that's what I'm doing. I'm moving my hand, adding a bit over here, adding a bit over there. And the other thing to also keep in mind is to make the reflection at the top lighter than at the bottom. So over here, this area you'll have a bit more darker, and then reduce it and make the reflection a bit lighter at the top. So that is how it is in nature, is that the reflection is most darkest near the ground. So that's what we will do over here. And then so this I'm happy with. So I like the light feel of reflection I have over here. And always also add this bit over here at the end. So this this indicates something without reflection. So this is the lightest without the reflection. Then here you have a bit of darker, adding more lines. And over here then you can add a bit more lines over here, and that will be the darkest. And there you can see that now our brain is interpreting and associating this darker area with the reflection, and these lines are indicating the kind of flow of the water, something like this. And if you want, you can add a bit more over here to indicate a bit more, to make it a bit more darker at the base over here, something like this. So this is yet another technique, for adding water reflection. And as you can see, by adding this water and adding a small reflection, now our landscape even has more vitality. It looks even nicer. It has more impact, and that's so that's something that you can always try with your landscape. When you have drawn some kind of trees or something else, you can always simply draw a river like this and just use these lines, right, to add reflection. So that's how easy it is. You just simply add lines like this, line like this, and just try and there we have it, right? So just by adding, and if you want, you can add a bit more over here, something like this. So there we have it. So this is how you can easily add reflection of a distant wooded area in water. And essentially you can use this technique to draw reflection of any element, and the effect is that you have a bit more feel of movement in the water. So this technique is is useful to draw the reflection when the water is moving, something like this over here. And what you can also do is to darken this edge a bit. So this gives it more impact. So I will just go ahead and darken the edges a bit over here as well. So this is how you can easily draw the water bank, and then use these lines and just make them overlapping a bit more, and then add more of them over here to darken it, and that starts to give it a nice hint of reflection in the water. And remember to keep this end light, so that you can have that contrast, right? So it's the contrast that brings out the feel in pen and ink. So it's not just the fact that this is dark, but this is light. So that contrast tells our mind that this is kind of reflection in the water of the trees. And then I'll go ahead and just add this, make the bank a bit more solid and a bit more dark to give it more impact. So again, that kind of contrast gives a nice impact in the drawing. So always try to add contrast wherever you can to make it more more interesting and more impactful. So that's what I did. I just added a bit more dark over here to the bank to make it very solid bank. And now we have this white spot. If you want, you can add a bit more grass, or just add some dots, something like this over here, just to create some kind of ground cover. So I'll just add a bit of dots, and there we have it. So this is how you can use the scribble strokes to create a distant wooded, not too distant. So this is where we have this, the size of the trees indicate how distant they are. So if you made the trees very small, then they will reduce more further out in distance. And here our trees are a bit bigger, but not too big. So this is a nice, I like this distance in a sense. You still feel a bit intimacy with the trees, but you can still draw further out trees at the bottom to indicate a nice wooded area. So this is how you can use those scribble strokes to create the foliage, initial foliage, and then draw the tree trunks, and somehow our mind connects it to. So that's what we saw with these with this technique, where we use the parallel lines, and the same we can be used with the scribble lines as well, and you can have a nice wooded area landscape. And what we also saw is to how to draw the reflection of these trees in the water using these kind of lines to indicate the movement of the water. So again, just draw these lines, and then over here just add more of them to kind of draw, make it a bit darker, and that is then interpreted by our mind as a reflection And there we have it. So this is how you can have a nice simple landscape in under 20 minutes and enjoy doing it anytime. Thanks. Take care. Bye bye.